Okay, hello and welcome everyone to our first webinar of the spring semester, though it doesn't feel like spring, I think, to anyone in this country right now. um, I first wanted to give the word to Fiona Barnett, who's directing the Haystack Scholars Project together with me, and then I'll take over and introduce Jim, who's our speaker today, and then Jim will take it from there. So Fiona, do you want to?
Great, yeah. Hi, everybody. I'm Fiona Barnett. I've been emailing with many of you, and I wish I could see some of your faces too. So feel free to jump on video. I think there's 10 spots for video. So I've been directing the Haystack Scholars Program for several years. This is our 7th year of the program, and each year we have about 200 to 250, mostly graduate students, but this year we have a lot of undergrads as well. And they are nominated from their home institution. Some of you are Haystack Scholars, and other of you who are calling in are not, which is why I'm giving the sort of brief background of the program. And people are nominated from their home program or home school to be representatives with the Haystack Scholars. And, part of that is about bringing material and their own research to the Haystack Scholars Group, and part of that is about learning things within Haystack and bringing that back to their own home campus. So we host forums, people blog. We've got a big conference coming up this year. We've been hosting several of these webinars. We do digital book collections, digital reviews, and people have gone on to do other kind. Can you hear better now, Bridget? Okay, great. People have gone on to do conference proposals, book proposals, and lots of other kinds of collaborative projects. And one of the great things about Haystack Scholars for me is really like the collaborative research agenda, where people are sort of learning to think in public and learning how to ask for help and reach out beyond their own disciplinary boundaries. Yeah, one of the cool things about Omeka, I think, is that it's a really flexible tool and can be used in a wide variety of for a wide variety of types of collections and types of material. And the plugin Neatline, which I think Jim will be talking about a little bit today, or at least we'll hopefully get to, can sort of visualize and showcase that material in a way that's very visual through either mapping or other kinds of visual representations of different kinds of data. So I love that you're all here today to learn about how to use this better. One of my questions is about whether or not people have used this in a classroom before. I'm teaching a class right now at Brown, and many of them are collecting different kinds of material, and I'd love to think about ways to include that in a classroom. So thanks for joining us, everybody. We will have time for Q&A at the end. We're going to keep you muted until then, but you can also keep your questions in that Google Doc that we've linked. We'll link to it again, just so you have it there. And I know that we're also collecting what kinds of projects that you're interested in doing in this other Google Docs so that we can see and make sure to answer any specific questions that relate to that. So thank you so much, Jim, for being here, and thank you everybody else for being here too.
Thank you, Fiona. I also wanted to welcome you to this webinar. I'm the other coder, or the other director for Haystack Scholars, and I am going to go ahead and introduce Jim. Jim, who's the host of today's forum, is a doctoral candidate in English at Northeastern University and a scholar in Northeastern's new lab for texts, maps, and networks. He's currently the project director of our Marathon, the Boston Bombing Digital Archive, and the coordinator for Northeastern's Digital Scholarship Group. His research interests include digital archives, new media, the history of the book, and the history of reading. And so he's going to tie all of this into this webinar that we're doing today. And as Fiona said, I've put all the links in the chat window. So if you're using, I'm not sure what it looks like on the web client actually, but if you have the desktop client, you should be able to see in the little chat window on your right, you should be able to see all of the links for everything here, which includes sharing your projects. You can put the questions in the collaborative document that we have for questions. There's a link to the slide share with all the slides that Jim are going to show, and also the link to a Sandbox installation of Omeka where you can play around, which Jim has very nicely put up there on his own website for us. And as Fiona said, we've muted you so that there's no feedback during the webinar, and I hope that you can all provide questions in the document that we've posted on Google, or that we'll be able to somehow take your questions later. And so without further ado, I wanted to let Jim give his presentation here. Thank you.
Thanks for everyone for joining today. I am in full screen mode just so people can see the slides, so if anything does come up, feel free to interrupt me and I can linger on some things. So just some introduction. So most of this was already walked through. So the slides are up. I have set up an Omeka Sandbox, and then there's just some other information there. So some of the things that I want to go through today I just want to provide an introduction and overview of Omeka. I want to talk about some examples of Omeka in action. I'm going to focus particularly on our marathon because that's what I have the most experience with. And then we can take a look at an Omeka installation. I've set up a basic installation on my personal website. And then we can also shift into looking at Neatline, which is not installed on my installation, but I can walk through the interface of that via our marathon if people are particularly interested in Neatline. And I'm happy to take some questions. I've seen some questions already talking about classroom use, so I'm attending to some of that in the presentation, but we can certainly follow up on that. So Omeka, the sort of basic overview, one of the great things about Omeka is that a lot of the material about Omeka is documented on Omeka's website. So this was a really invaluable resource on the Our Marathon project, particularly the forums, which are very active, and the people working on Omeka are just very quick to respond and deal with various issues. So that's just a site that you should get more acquainted with if you're starting to think about using Omeka. Just to give a little general background, Dan Cohen, who many people probably know from the Digital Public Library of America and the September 11th Digital Archive, is one of the people behind Omeka, and it really did come from this idea, from the experience of working on the September 11th Digital Archive and thinking about how there was so much time and energy and resources devoted to this project, being the September 11th Digital Archive, but there's a need for projects to exist in other institutions and for people to have the particular resources and the ability to do digital curation and exhibits. So Omeka is a real attempt to simplify the process to make sure that institutions don't have to be devoting a lot of time and money to particular areas if they don't have the resources to do so. And as Fiona was saying before, it is very flexible and dynamic. So there's been a lot of different uses of it, and it continues to change with time and as people start to experiment more with different uses of it. So in the instance of our marathon, like some of the crowdsourcing work we did took Omeka in a slightly different direction, but I'll talk more about that in a bit. So the really cute log line for Omeka that I did not come up with, but it was part of the introduction, is it's WordPress for museums. It sort of serves a similar function to WordPress. It's a web publishing platform for items, exhibits, and collections. It's designed with scholars, librarians, educators, and archivists in mind. And it is designed to be easy to use. So the learning curve, there is a learning curve, but it's not something where you need to have a sort of extensive background in web design or a lot of experience to get something up and running, something that's engaging and usable for students and for the general public. It's really interested in curation and metadata and the importance of metadata and providing resources so that people can contextualize the material that they're working on and connects items to each other in an easy way. So potential uses, this is just an overview of how people have been using it. So classroom instruction obviously is something that a lot of people are interested in with Omeka. So, and this could be collaborative projects, semester-long projects, or individual exhibit building work. It is a really effective, I think, introduction to metadata and the importance of metadata. and providing additional contextual matter to digital artifacts that some people might not, particularly students, might not have at the forefront of their brains. It's really useful for public humanities work, making content accessible, putting it up relatively quickly onto the web. It's useful for collaborations between GLAM. This is a term I've glommed from Amanda Rust here at Northeastern with this idea of the galleries, libraries, archivists, and museum communities, making sure that there are more opportunities to work between people in departments like the English department here at Northeastern and some of these other communities. It can be used for short-term projects, and you could set things up privately, but it is ideal for longer projects. It helps. It enables afterlives of projects that people do in the classroom, which I think is valuable to both educators and to students, depending on what kind of work they're doing. You can host content on your own server space, but you can also use the Omeka.net version of Omeka, which I'll talk a little bit more about later. So there are a lot of advantages, I think, to Omeka. So it's easy to create and update metadata using Dublin Core standards. I'll talk a bit more about Dublin Core in a bit. It's useful when thinking of long-term aspirations. Again, this idea of digital projects having afterlives, not just being things that students work on and then never look at again, or that stuff that doesn't recirculate beyond that. There are exhibit templates in place in Omeka, which are useful for people who do not have background with web design. They can there are ready-made templates that students can use fairly quickly. It's easy to geotag and make use of geotagging, given the interest in mapping that we see in a lot of digital humanities projects. Geotagging is important there. It is flexible. You can use templates, but you could also create new pages in Omeka using the Simple Pages feature of Omeka. It's open source, and as I said, there's tons of documentation, and it can be relatively inexpensive or free to make use of. So Omeka.net is one option that for people who don't have a lot of experience with servers or things like that to pursue. So there's no server or FTP required. Everything is hosted by Omeka. And then the basic plan gives you one site. You have a range of themes, and you have plugins, which are important to how Omeka works. So you're able to build exhibits. You're able to do CSV imports, which are imports where if you're dealing with a lot of files that you want to put into Omeka at once rather than individually, that's an important tool. And then Simple Pages, which allows you just to create pages using your own templates and design and things like that. And then there's omeka.org. So there you might need a little bit more experience, or you might need some institutional background or backing and support to get some of that stuff up and running. You have the flexibility to customize themes and to even create your own plugins and do other cool stuff like that. And there is an unlimited number of plugins and themes that you can make use of, in part due to the fact that you have the server access and things like that. So those are the two main options there. I did want to talk a bit about metadata and Dublin Core. So first of all, it's Dublin, Ohio. It's not Dublin, Ireland, which is the Dublin and Dublin Core. That is where the standards were first discussed and created. So it's a set of metadata standards. There's this idea that rather than having all institutions come up with their own terminology and procedures that and which could potentially silo cultural memory, that there's a more communal aspect to it. People talk about standards and things like that, and open up the cultural heritage data that various institutions or researchers might have. It's meant to encourage interdisciplinary work, and it's also a very collaborative sort of work in progress project in terms of setting conventions and talking about conventions and things like that. I do want to stress, because this has come up when I've talked about Omeka with, particularly with professors who are interested in digital exhibits. I do think that the exhibits are really interesting and engaging, but you do need to spend some time thinking about and talking about metadata. You should, if you're not familiar with Dublin Core, do a little bit of reading on it. There's a lot of documentation there, or potentially talk to people at your institution in the libraries or archives who have experiences with metadata. And I think these are the useful discussions also to stage in the classroom with students. There's this idea that metadata is a love letter to the future. This is a phrase that I've heard at archivist conferences. So thinking about that, don't just thinking of it as data entry work or things like that. So it is essential that if you're using the stuff in the classroom, you should have some sort of conversation about metadata. And then stylistic conventions are important too. Like if you're having students adding items or editing content, you will at an early stage and probably before the class, if you're thinking of classroom use, want to think about what stylistic conventions your metadata should have, how you're making use of Dublin core, and things like that. Again, there is documentation online, but collaborations, you can have collaborations with local institutions as well. For instance, on the Our Marathon project, we kind of sheepishly went to the library and said, we're just learning about this thing called metadata, and they said, oh great, you know, that you came to the right place, and they helped us develop some particular standards, and we had a lot of good conversations about how we're using Dublin core and what we should be documenting, what we should be focusing on, and things like that. But the exhibits are cool. So the exhibit plugin feature of Omeka does give you these design templates that you know, limit the options that students can have, but I think in a productive way so that they don't get too preoccupied with not knowing about web design, and this also works for teachers as well. So you know, it's a lot of sort of text, visual, you know, sort of options that are built into it. Neatline, there's more of a learning curve, but it's definitely something that people are interested in. I'll talk more about how Neatline's been used and what the advantages of Neatline are. And then if you do have experience with HTML or PHP, or you know where to you know, grab some cool code and things like that, or you want to design your own layouts, the Simple Pages feature of Omeka gives you that flexibility, and the Our Marathon project has made a lot of use of Simple Pages. We've used all three: the exhibits with students, Neatline with some of our own in-house exhibits, and then Simple Pages for certain sections of our site. And then this is just an image of some exhibit templates. So I mean, this is pretty straightforward. So if you have a collection that's really visual and you want to showcase that, you can provide layouts that do so. If you want to have more context that's text-centric, you know, you can sort of switch back and forth. But this is just an overview of some of the options that you have in terms of templates. Again, you know, stressing this metadata thing. This slide, I think, was supposed to come 2 slides before, and now I'm back talking about metadata. But I think it is, if you're thinking about classroom use, there are a whole bunch of cool ways that you can talk about metadata with your students, to talk about stylistic conventions, and to really, I think sometimes there could be resistance from students if they think that, you know, you're basically deploying them to do data entry work for your own research, to make sure that you're front-loading that conversation, you know, in interesting ways, and how it adds to the historical record and things like that. So back to exhibits. So Neatline is a plugin that is used with Omeka that enables you to do some really cool stuff with regard to mapping geospatial metadata, but also doing some temporal stuff. There's a timeline feature in Neatline that you can use to sort of navigate through different years and things like that. So this image here is from a sample internal Neatline exhibit that we were doing with the Marathon project, where we were starting to map the marathon route in here. In terms of the features and advantages of Neatline, so you can create these narratives that attend to space and temporality. It shows how you can use geotag metadata in productive ways. You can create dynamic and interactive exhibits. There are a bunch of map templates that are already built into the plugin. But if you're working with earlier materials, historical projects, and you have some experience with georectification, or you're interested in georectification, you can also do that too. You can embed maps from earlier periods, you know, if you have access to them, and you're able to use them onto Neatline and do cool stuff that way. You can also map images, so you can treat images as if they're maps, which I'll talk a bit more about. So there is a learning curve to this, but there's an extensive set of documentation on the Neatline site as well. So a lot of this stuff, and there are a lot of people working with the stuff and talking about it on social media too. So that's another useful resource to have there. In terms of questions that you should think about if you're gravitating towards or considering using Omeka, particularly in the classroom, you should be thinking about what students are getting out of this work and why this tool seems important to introduce them to, but also what you're getting out of this work. If you have external collaborators, or if you're roping in people from the libraries or the archives or elsewhere, how are they defining the value of the experience of working on this project? You should be thinking slightly more long-term. So what happens to this work after the course? Even if you're trying out Omeka for the first time in a semester, what's the sort of post-semester evaluation process? Where does this material go? Where does it live institutionally? Things like that. When you're designing projects, you should really consider scope. How long is this going to take to introduce, set up, and discuss? Is this one assignment? Is this a semester-long assignment? Is this a week? And is Omeka the digital tool that you actually want to think about? Or do you want to talk about metadata? Do you want students to have hands-on experience using exhibits? Try to avoid just shoehorning the tool into the course just because a lot of people are using Omeka, and there are certainly lots of good reasons why you would want to make use of Omeka in the course. There are some practical questions that I just wanted to get on the table too. I mean, you should be thinking about how much time you have to work on this, how much you can do on your own, how much time you've spent before a semester playing with Omeka. I mean, I would recommend looking at it and making use of one of the Sandbox features before you dive into it in a semester. What prep work needs to happen before the class starts? What are the short and long-term goals? Have you thought about collaborators? Are there resources on your campus that already make use of digital tools? Who will access the site? And then really think about like how the divisions of labor are going to work here. How much time are you investing into it? What are you expecting undergrads to do? Are you roping poor grad students into this, or librarians, or people in IT, and things like that? And then, this just to follow up, who might be interested in Omeka? Usually people who are making use of Omeka like to talk about that they're using Omeka, but you might even consider accessing library or EdTech resources. Are there metadata specialists at your library? Server access is going to be important. That's an important thing to consider because I have had some experiences where educators have started working with Omeka. They had a conversation where they got it set up on a server at their facility, but it became difficult to update that by getting the sort of plugins that they wanted to use and things like that. So you want to think about what are the lines of communication that you're going to have for getting on the server if you want to make some modifications, or what are the advantages of setting something up on your own server or using Omeka.net. Do you want this hosted by your institution? Is this something that aligns with the institution's mission, or there are benefits to doing that, or is this something that you want to host on your own? What are the intellectual property questions that might pop up? What is this material that you're making use of here? And what are the long-term preservation options? One of the things that we did here at Northeastern with our marathon project is we started at a very early stage working with our archives and special collections to get them thinking about where is this stuff going to live? And one of the good things about Omeka is that you can, in many ways, it's easy for you to. It's not like something that happens with the click of a button, but if you want to take in content out of Omeka and put it somewhere else, you do have the option to do that, and you can have conversations about how to do that. These are just some considerations for lesson plans. I do think that in addition to thinking about if you're going to have an Omeka unit or if Omeka is going to play a role in your semester, you should think about how those discussions are in conversation with the not tech-heavy parts of your course. This question of is this an Omeka unit or a unit about a particular topic, like digital archives or the public history or things like that, and then Omeka is the tool that you're using. Those are important considerations to have, and I think they're just useful things to keep in mind rhetorically as you're introducing the stuff to your students. How much time are you going to spend introducing it? How are you going to even grade some of this work? These are questions to keep in mind. And for your own sake, if you're spending all this time and these resources working with Omeka, how is that going to fit into your own research goals and aims and future collaborations? Those are things to keep in mind. At Northeastern, I have, with the former project director, Alicia Peaker, who used to work on our marathon, we have gone to classes and talked about Omeka and worked with instructors who've set aside time to do that. But it does take time. There are questions that the students have. There are questions that the faculty members have. And then at times there's a need for follow-up. There's a need potentially to make yourself available via email and things like that. So just keep all that stuff into consideration while you're making lesson plans and things like that. So I want to switch into talking about our marathon and why we used Omeka, how we used it, what modifications we made, because one of the things that I notice a lot in discussions of Omeka is there's the out-of-the-box version of Omeka, and then there are the plugins that you can download, but then sometimes you'll look at other Omeka installations and you'll say, oh, that does not look anything like the thing that I have sitting on my server. So you want to keep that stuff in mind and think about the tools and resources that other people have used to modify and customize Omeka. I'll talk a bit about Neatline and then talk about some of the lessons we learned from using Omeka here. So our marathon is a live site. It's been up since May of 2013. The URL is there. Why did we use Omeka? Why did we think about doing this? So we're a crowdsourced digital archive of content related to the marathon bombings and their aftermath. This was a project that started very quickly at Northeastern. The funding and the initial discussions happened in late April of 2013. Ryan Cordell and Elizabeth Maddock-Dillon were the faculty leads and the people responsible for bringing graduate students like me into the project. At an early stage, they were interested not just in the potential for crowdsourcing, but what sort of historical records are going to be part, of this larger story. It's not enough just to sort of grab people's pictures or ask people to submit their Facebook photos, but how are we thinking about building more robust metadata records? We wanted the content to be accessible and to be up live as soon as possible. We wanted to have the option to create exhibits out of the materials that we were gathering. We wanted to encourage educational uses, so thinking about the best ways of displaying material or setting up spaces where students might collaborate with us and set up exhibits. We didn't have a lot of money for web design or some of the other resources. And again, we wanted this thing to go up very quickly. So these are some of the reasons why Omeka stood out to Ryan and Elizabeth as the publishing platform for this stuff. So this is the homepage for our marathon, and the sort of gray bar at the top here is where the Omeka login instance happens. This is a sample of some of the crowdsourced content we received. So these are some of the metadata fields that are filled out by people who are contributing here. So they described, they told their story in the description fields. They told us who they were. We encouraged them to provide dates and information about where they were. So we were interested in using Omeka as a platform for crowdsourcing. We created this Share Your Story contribution plugin that I'll talk about in a sec. We wanted to showcase particular materials in our special collections. So we have a bunch of material from the Boston City Archives. We had a collaboration with the WBUR NPR station here. They gave us money for oral histories. Again, we wanted a space for student collaborations, and we wanted to create exhibits in Neatline. So this is a picture of our contribution plugin. So this is not an out-of-the-box Omeka thing. Omeka does have a contribution plugin, but for the purposes of our project, we thought it looked a little too much like kind of like a form letter thing or something that you'd fill out when you had to deal with like a technical error on a website or something like that. So we did hire someone to create this contribution plugin, and basically these questions up here are encouraging people to fill out some of the desired metadata fields that we had for the crowdsourced project. This is a sample collection page, which was created using the Simple Pages plugin on Omeka, so we wanted to play around a bit with the design of this and make it a bit more engaging. So the simple pages feature does let you go in and play around with code if you have experience or you have collaborators with experience doing that. And then we have classroom exhibits in Omeka. We worked with a college writing class. The instructor had no real experience with Omeka, but was interested in the archival project. So these students created exhibits primarily using the exhibit plugin feature of Omeka, the basic templates there, and they did all sorts of really amazing stuff. Talking about social media, first-hand accounts, and things like that. We came in and talked a bit about Omeka and the technical needs of Omeka, but they were pretty quick studies in terms of using the templates they had to tell interesting stories about the event and bring in new materials. So some of the lessons from these classroom collaborations we had. We did find it really valuable to have students working on things that circulated beyond the classroom, and we found that students were really engaged by this idea, and that it's not just busy work that's completed. That's particularly in like required writing courses, which kind of have a negative stigma among some students. Exhibits are a way of documenting what was learned about technology and the content as well. There are challenges with regard to collaborative writing and design, but in some cases, these are the kinds of challenges that some of these students might be facing in workplace situations. So, so the collaborative work that went on there, I think, had far-reaching applications there. It is useful to talk about failure in terms of technology or in terms of perceived limitations of design and things like that. Or even more broadly, if you made use of Omeka in the classroom and it didn't go the way that you wanted it to, thinking about what didn't work about the presentation or the execution of that. It was really important, we thought, for educators to set clear goals for the semester and goals tied to the momentum of a larger project. And then it was really important to have these sort of metacognitive moments where you talked about why and how you're using particular tools and why we're spending all this time in the classroom making use of this particular digital tool. In terms of the modifications that we made on our marathon, so we did modify the contribution plugin. So there's a need to make this contribution face engaging and to contextualize the metadata requests. And we did do some web design cleanup. We hired someone to do that. As well to improve the layout of the site sections, and then also our media and institutional partners were kind of interested in adding an extra layer of gloss to the site. And then we made a lot of use of Neatline, particularly over the summer where we had exhibits set up there. So Neatline is designed as a mapping tool, but we became interested in this idea of mapping images, particularly content related to the Copley Square Memorial that we had in the archive. So instead of a map layer, we were layering photos, and undergrads and volunteers from Simmons College helped work on these projects. So one of our Neatline exhibits, which is actually featured on the Neatline website as well, was created by an undergraduate who didn't have much experience with Omeka. It was Nate Rumdaly, who's a Trico DH visiting scholar or student over the summer, and we had this really cool poster with all of this information on it that we wanted to showcase and highlight. So Nate, after having discussions with us, went in, came up with ideas for particular categories of content to highlight, and then created this interface with Neatline that highlighted things like the Boston Strong references and things like that. And then we also have another Neatline exhibit that was created by a Simmons College graduate student, where we have this widescreen image from Fenway Park. So we wanted to do an exhibit that walked people through the relationship between sports and the Red Sox, and the events of the bombings and things like that. Other examples of Omeka, I'll roll through these pretty quickly. Most of them are on the showcase site or the Neatline demo site. So this is a really cool project that just went live recently, the Isaiah Thomas Broadside Ballads project from the American Antiquarian Society that is, the interface lets people go through these broadsides and the annotations that were set up by the AAS. Digital Dos Passos, this was a project that's been around for a while by Amanda Visconti that walks through the literature of the USA trilogy. makes use of visuals and other contextual information. This Gulag project, Many Days, Many Lives, is, I think, a useful one to look at because there is clearly some design work that's gone into it, but you can clearly see the exhibit plugins, that are out of the box in Omeka, being deployed here and the description fields and things like that. So that's one I like to show people because it, there's clearly some investments in design, but a lot of this stuff looks like stuff that you can do with the out-of-the-box version of Omeka. And then in terms of Neatline, there's been some really cool stuff going on. So this project from the University of Virginia, you can see down here that this timeline bar is showing the sort of temporal function of Neatline, and then you can see there are these polygons that are drawn onto this map, and there's contextual information here, so you can get a sense of more of the interface of Neatline there. The Black Liberation 1969 archive at Swarthmore, this Google map, Google Maps are part of the Neatline package. So then there's some really interesting design work going on with the polygons here and providing the contextual information about some of these resources. So now this is kind of leading into this Q&A portion or discussion portion, but I did want to give people a chance to look around in Omeka and to play around in a sandbox. So I set up a very basic Omeka instance on my personal website. The link is there, and I have a general username and password that people can use. I set this up via Reclaim Hosting, which I'm not getting paid by Reclaim to do this. This Ryan Cordell recommended using Reclaim because they have a one-click installation of Omeka and a few other server companies where you can buy server space have this too. So Neatline is not installed on here, and there are some plugins that are not installed. But because I did want to just show you, here's kind of what an out-of-the-box instance looks like, and here's what the backend looks like. But I can also walk you through our Marathon's backend to show you guys more about Neatline if you're curious about that and how the interface looks there too. So we can go into that. I mean, I think at this stage we can unmute some people and get some questions. If people have stuff that they want to talk about as they're looking through this Omeka instance. In the interest of using material that I have oversight of, I was using these family photos that my father, who's kind of an obsessive archivist of our weird family, had and had posted on Flickr. So I put a lot of this stuff into Omeka just to give you a sense of how this works. But in the Omeka instance, I mean, you feel free to add items or even modify items that are already in here. You can just upload random files and things like that. But I think playing with a sandbox version, you get a sense of what the dashboard looks like and what some of the features of it are, where certain stuff lives, what an item looks like in the back end of Omeka versus using the public page feature to look at what it looks like in the front end. And sort of things like that. And then also another thing that you can notice here is you can get a sense of how plugins work with Omeka. So these are some of the out-of-the-box plugins that come when you do a sort of basic server install. Omeka has extensive documentation on the various plugins that they can use. For the sake of comparison, this is the Sandbox version that I have, which has like these 3 plugins in here. And then if we look here at our Marathon collection of plugins, we can see that for a project like our Marathon, we have a lot of other needs beyond, say, like a classroom that's just getting used to metadata and playing with items. We have our personal contribution plugin that we set up here. We have a CSV import. We're connected to Dropbox. We make use of extended Dublin core instead of just simple Dublin core. We have things that don't work, but that's okay. Google Analytics, geolocation stuff, and things like that. And the plugins, again, besides like the personal customized ones, you can all find on the Omeka website. And then if you're interested in Neatline, again, Neatline has a whole bunch of information about its particular plugin and stuff on there too.
Jim, I have a question for you. What would you say is do you know of like a good resource on how to introduce the concept of metadata to people on your team, or a good resource that kind of explains best practices, or basically how do you get started with that with other people on your team if you have the collection in mind? Like,
yeah.
How do you start with metadata?
So the way that I've talked about metadata, because I think one of the things that you'll notice is if you look at like the Dublin core standards or other standards on there, they kind of read like stereo instructions, right? When you look at the sort of initial version of them. So the basic way that I walk people through metadata, or I've had success in the past in doing that, is I look at Twitter, because a lot of undergrads are really interested in Twitter, and kind of walk people through the various metadata that is connected to a tweet. And I mean, in some cases, I might even just like use an Excel spreadsheet to sort of document that. There are like blog resources out there. I'm just blanking on the particular ones, but I can add that to there. But I do find that like Twitter is useful because like students know what Twitter is. Students are aware of some of these general conversations about metadata as they relate to surveillance and things like that. And then you can also, by talking about Twitter, talk about the uses of metadata, because so many people are doing interesting, sort of visualizations and things like that for a metadata discussion. The only drawback to the metadata discussion is you're probably not going to be like creating an archive of tweets in Omeka. Omeka is not useful for doing something like that necessarily, but I do think it's a good starting point for a conversation.
Okay. Other people have questions? Jim, this is so helpful. It was like such a great overview. My goodness, have you done this before?
Yeah, I mean,
a lot. Yeah.
Yeah, I guess I have. Because we're really interested in Omeka here and working with the Digital Scholarship Group. I mean, this is one of the things that we like to talk about. I'm just looking at some of the questions here. The question about low programming skills, can I still use Omeka? Yes, you can still use Omeka. You might want to think about what particular uses of Omeka you have, but I mean, if you're interested in displaying various records or documents and doing cool things with adding metadata context and adding context to exhibits that are built, I think Omeka is a useful platform, for doing this kind of stuff. The examples of Omeka in the classroom, in addition to our marathon stuff, a lot of the resources that I tried to walk through quickly towards the end there are a lot of them started in the classroom or continue to be built in the classroom. I don't think it's too ambitious for a semester, and I think you can even have an Omeka unit. You might think about how you're introducing Omeka and what exactly you want students doing in Omeka. Some people get a little, well, there are institutional reasons to get antsy about giving students access to things that live on institutional servers. There are also, you can create different user settings for students that only give them access to certain parts of the Omeka instance. Super user is the sort of default for the admin use. And then the admin user have a lot of privileges too. I mean, that's another thing to think about in the classroom is how, what roles are students having on these projects? Are there going to be project leaders who need access to Omeka? Does everyone get access to Omeka? And there are sort of different advantages and disadvantages to giving everyone access or just giving a few students access.
So I have another question about what are some common like roadblocks that people face, not just students, but even people within the museums or library or other kinds of collectives who are starting up an Omeka project. Like, if they're not advanced users, like what are some of the common like kind of moments or like yeah, moments of frustration for people?
Yeah, I think some of the frustrations come from if you're trying to do everything yourself, and if part of that is just because like that time is valuable, and you don't necessarily want to rope a bunch of other people into it, into the work you're doing. Sometimes that can get in the way though, of you know drawing on the experiences that lots of people have with Omeka. So I think like one of the things that I learned very quickly, because I had to, because I was working on this sort of large public project, was not being shy on the forums of just asking questions that maybe sort of questions for people who are have been using Omeka for a while but are still new to me, and the forum community is useful about like pointing people in the direction of where stuff has already been documented or not documented. Not being shy about going to the libraries, going to archives, thinking of what networks you have, whether it's at your institution or in your region that have made use of this. I do think like one big roadblock is people who like if you haven't thought through the scope of your use of Omeka and you kind of get too ambitious early on without figuring out the logistics, that can be kind of a roadblock sometimes. I mean, I've had discussions, again, this relates back to stuff that seems basic or mundane, like access to servers or having issues where students are sort of tripping over each other in Omeka because you haven't sort of given them particular spaces or roles in the classroom to use. So I think like starting small with a project that might only take a unit or might lead to a larger thing is a way to go, is a more effective way of thinking about Omeka if you're sort of new to it and you're intimidated by it to a certain extent. Did that answer some of?
Yeah, totally.
Okay.
Yeah, I was just asking in the GoToMeeting here if any other people who have used Omeka, I can see Brad and Rachel and Linda and possibly Olivia have used Omeka. If any of you guys are interested in piping in with your own experiences or feedback or tips for other people and getting started, that would be awesome. Oh, Linda says she hasn't used it. Anybody else? Brad says my colleagues have used Omeka.
Yeah, I mean, I think somebody is saying it is confusing at first. I mean, I think that's why that's the great thing about the Sandbox feature is is in the same way that like you might not expect students to just sort of be picking up things naturally in a writing class or history class or anything like that. Like actually spending time with the interface, because there are things in the Omeka interface that I remember when I first started using it would drive me insane. Like I'd be like, why is this clickable and this isn't clickable, and things like that. And it just you get a clearer sense of the sort of conventions and design of it and what it's useful for and why it's working a certain way. The other good thing about Omeka is like if you don't like some of the interface issues or things like that, you can talk about that on the forum. And I mean, Omeka, the thing that I like about Omeka is that there's clearly been a lot of time and energy and money that's been put into having it continue to build and get bigger. So it's not something that you're gonna all of a sudden go to omeka.org and it's all gonna be gone one day. There's a clear sort of investment in refining it and building it.
So there was a question here of whether or not Omeka can display or use interface with PDF at all.
Yeah, I'm trying to think of the specifics of displaying PDFs. I can't remember if we have any PDFs in the R Marathon. archive. I'm sure that people have used PDFs before, but I'll follow up on the, if there are challenges, particular challenges to using PDFs there. The question about the slug line is the slug is basically where you create the URL, the sort of URL for where the pages that you're creating via exhibits and things like that live. So you can customize that and sort of think about like what terms you might want to have there that demonstrate like the more details on the content, or also help it pop up more on search engines results and things like that. The question about using your own image database and not uploading the entire collection to Omeka, I think that would depend on where the images are hosted. I know that there's a Flickr plugin. Thanks for the answer to that. You can display PDFs with the Docs Viewer plugin. Yeah, I figured there was some sort of plugin, that had attended to that use there. You can bring in images from elsewhere, but that's the way that we've been working with it. We've been my experiences with it have been uploading our own content and having it hosted on the institutional servers there. Question about making Excel files accessible for viewing, downloading, and joint editing, as well as digital humanities type objects. I mean, I think with Excel, if you're doing a lot of work with Excel and you're sharing that, I think Google works pretty well for some of that. And I know, at least in my experiences, I haven't spent a lot of time thinking of using Omeka as the publishing platform for that. Because, I mean, I'd be curious, this kind of gets back to that metadata question, is like, if you're putting this stuff into Omeka, the value of it is that you can add all of this other sort of historical context. And so, yeah, so I don't know if it would be, it doesn't seem as immediately useful for that context. I'm just trying to look at more of the questions here. This question about working with other people's archives is I think, a useful one too, because like that might be an interesting approach to it, is rather than necessarily having your own Omeka instance where you have everything housed, like thinking of a larger collaboration, or thinking about archives that already exist that encourage the creation of exhibits, and things like that.
Jim, I think that there are more questions on the Google Doc.
The question of oh yeah.
Sorry. I think that there are more questions on the Google Doc. Yeah.
All right. So yeah, I'll jump. I just saw this question here. The question of bringing in images from other websites. I mean, you do want to think about the rights attached to images. The answer to that question would be like if it's stuff that has Creative Commons licenses and things like that. It might be stuff that you can bring in. But you want to be clear, especially if you're housing things on institutional servers, that like you have the right to display that publicly and put that in this place. Practical questions, yeah, I mean those are good. I think like one thing that you don't want to do, if you're thinking of a large-scale project like our marathon. While grad students got a lot of value from working on that, we also got paid, and we got paid pretty well, and we had to sort of make a case for being bought out of our teaching contracts and sort of things like that, because at its peak when we were very active on our marathon, we were putting in anywhere from 20 to 40 hours a week.
Yeah, I think some of those where I was actually taking notes while you were. They look like questions, but they were actually notes from your presentation.
Oh, okay. Okay.
Yeah, they were such helpful phrasings. I thought they were really good framework to share with people.
Experiences with the privacy setting. Yeah, I mean that's you can make things private. I think the privacy settings are useful when you're doing work in progress. So, for example, with our marathon, like we would do these large uploads of images and files. but we didn't clean up the metadata, and then we would keep all those files private and then delegate metadata cleanup duties to team members to do that, and then review them and then make them public. So I think like the privacy setting is useful if you want to put everything in the Omeka instance, or you want to be able to access it via Omeka, but I think some of these projects, they take their time rolling things out publicly, but there's a lot of stuff that's living in Omeka that, the public can't access.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I think we have a question in the chat here. How was the marathon project funded, Jim?
So the funding came from a few different sources. We got some initial seed funding from Northeastern. We got funding from some of our institutional partners. So WBUR funded the oral history project component. So that was the recording, the design of the site, the audio engineering, and the time it took to put that stuff up on the site. We got some funding from a group called Iron Mountain, which does digital preservation. They graciously digitized a lot of the items that the Boston City Archives had gathered from the various memorial sites and letters that had been sent to the city. So that funding went towards metadata cleanup explicitly. So they had all these files that they had cleaned up, but they didn't have a lot of context on where they're from, or the context wasn't set up in accordance with Dublin core standards. So last summer we used those resources to really put a dent into making more robust metadata for those records, and thinking about how we could arrange them and sort of combine stuff.
Thank you.
I mean, one thing to think about too is if you're thinking about using Omeka and sort of scaling it up, you should be thinking about potential grant opportunities and things like that. One of the things that was really valuable, but it came a bit late in our experiences working on our marathon, was I took a course on project development at HILTS, the Humanities Intensive Learning and Teaching Institute that was at Maryland last summer. Simon and Jen Giuliano ran that, and that was like amazingly useful. I mean, a lot of Omeka stuff, it dovetails with project management stuff, depending on how large of a scale project is. English majors who are interested in this stuff should be open to learning more about project management. It's not Shakespeare, it's not T.S. Eliot, but it's important and useful stuff. Would I suggest starting with Omeka.net to get a sense of the interface? Yes. Yeah, definitely. My experiences with Omeka.net are colored by the fact that I started with Omeka.org. So there are some limitations to what you can do in Omeka.net, but those limitations I think are clearly spelled out by the documentation that's on there. And if your goal is to set up a space where you can upload items, have students work closely with metadata, create exhibits, or even just like a personal research site, I think starting with Omeka.net makes complete sense, particularly if you don't have a lot of experience with servers, or that you don't have many institutional resources or things like that. And the Sandbox gives you a sense of what that might be like too.
But Jim, you said that the limitation.
Sorry.
Oh, sorry.
Oh, no, you go ahead.
Okay. So, Jim, I just wanted to point out, you said that the Omeka.net installation is limited to 500 megabytes per user.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So that would be like the obvious limitation then if you were to start out with this, that you would have to, if you wanted to create an archive that's bigger than that, you would have a problem, I guess.
Yeah, you'd want to know how quickly you hit that wall.
Right.
By doing that. Yeah.
Would you be able to transfer if you started on net, would you be able to export that and start, if you were to hit that wall, somehow export it or start a new site based on that?
Yeah, I think that would be pretty straightforward to do.
Yeah.
I mean, it just makes sense. I haven't had experience doing that or talked to people who have done it. But yeah, my sense is that it's par for the course in terms of moving it into another Omeka instance.
Awesome. Jim, this was so helpful.
Thanks.
Yeah, it was really helpful, really well organized, and for people that have never sort of dropped into this much, it's so helpful to see like an overview of the kinds of things to be taking into consideration.
Yeah, and I'm happy to talk more about particular details, and then also, if people, I'll provide my email address somewhere if it's not there yet, because then I can sort of consult, more specific things on the forums or things like that. If people have particular questions, I'm happy to talk more about it.
Yeah, that's so kind of you.
Very nice, thank you. I did post in the chat the slides from the talk, and so you can all sort of access it there. And if your email is on the slides, I guess that's where people can easily find the email address too.
Yeah, and I'll update that if it's not.
Great.
There, so.
Thank you.
Thank you so much on your Friday afternoon. Hope you stay warm.
Thanks. You too, guys. Stay warm and enjoy your weekends.
Yeah, so we are going to post this eventually, and we'll make sure to link we'll be in touch though with we'll clean out the Google Docs, and we'd love to link your slides. That's really helpful, and make a little showcase out of it because you put a lot of time into this, and it was so well done. Thank you so much.
Thanks for inviting me to do it.
Thank you.
Thanks, Jim.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody.
Take care. Bye.